We continue our discussion of the US-Iran war that is happening right now. So, as you know, I made the prediction that the United States will lose this war. In last class, we did an overview of the military and strategic position. And today, we're going to provide some theoretical framework for how to understand how this war will progress and why ultimately I believe the United States will lose this war. Today, I present to you a very important idea in game theory. And once you understand this idea, you understand why things will turn out the way they do. Okay, it's called a law of asymmetry. Okay, law of asymmetry. And all this is saying is that the United States and Iran are not peers. They're not equals. The United States is far stronger than Iran. And we should expect the United States to overwhelm and destroy Iran really easily. The law of asymmetry states that that's usually not the case. It's usually the underdog that has the advantage. And we see this from history all the time. Okay, so when the Persians in about 490 BC invaded mainland Greece against Athens and Sparta, Persia at that time was the first world empire. It had infinite resources, infinite manpower, infinite wealth. And it lost to the Greeks not once, but twice. And then the Macedonians under Alexander the Greek, and they were like a tribal army, not a very large army. They were able to go into Persia, and Persia at the time was basically most of Eurasia, and conquered it in about 10 years' time. The Romans started off as a tribal people, which then built the Mediterranean Empire. Then you had the Aztecs, so the Vikings. So this happens a lot in human history. A people in the borderlands, a tribe, a small ethnicity, are able to conquer a great empire. And the law of asymmetry tells us why, okay? So I'm gonna go over very slowly in detail how this law of asymmetry works. All right, so let's look at an empire. And there are three major advantages to an empire, all right? The first is mass. This just means that they have a lot of people, okay? They almost have an infinite amount of people. The United States has a population of about 350 million people. But remember, the United States can also draw on the populations of its allies, which includes the Five Eyes, the Anglosphere, but it also includes Europe. It also includes East Asia, South Korea, Japan. Basically, wherever the Americans have a military base, right? So most of the world are either allies of the United States or vassals of the United States. So the United States can basically draw on in billions and billions of people for its wars, okay? So it's mass. Second is the idea of organization. Organization just means a hierarchy of bureaucracy and elite that allows you to organize your resources and your people in order to generate wealth, which is basically science and technology, okay? Science and technology, which leads to the most advanced weaponry, okay? So think about the United States, how they fight this war. They have these satellites that provide for precision targeting. They have these airplanes, these B-2 bombers, F-15s, that are the most advanced weaponry ever in human history. Okay? So organization. And the last great strength of the empire is the idea of death. Death is the idea that because your people are infinite, because your organization is so strong, because your resources are so vast, you can afford to lose many, many wars, okay? It's not a big deal if the United States loses this war in Iran. If they want to go back, they can go back with even more soldiers, even more weaponry, because their wealth is infinite, okay? So these are the three major advantages of an empire. And in theory, because of these advantages, an empire should be invincible and eternal. But we know for a fact that all empires fall, and they fall very, very hard. And quite honestly, they don't last a very long time. Maybe 28 years, maybe 300 years for most empires. That's not a very long time. So we need to better understand what's going on, okay? Why is it that an empire with these vast resources, they all fall in 200 years, 300 years, okay? All right, so what we need to understand is that all these advantages are ultimately disadvantages in the long term, all right? So let me explain what I mean. Mass, you have a lot of people, okay? When you have a lot of people, you create a lot of inequality. Why? Because there's competition for resources. There's too many people, okay? And this often leads to debt and slavery. And as a result, your people become complacent, lazy, indifferent. They're competing against each other. They really don't like the government, okay? So they're not really that motivated to do anything to work or to fight wars, but especially to fight wars. So this mass looks like an advantage in the beginning, but over time it becomes a disadvantage, right? Organization means an elite. The problem with this is that over time the elite become parasites. Why? Because the way they make their money is through rent seeking. Rent seeking just means that you have power and you seek to monetize your power by exploiting the mass. All right? So basically landlords are a classic type of rent-seeking elite. And so they don't really work, but they make a lot of money because they own the land, because they control all the resources, because they control all the capital. And that forces the mass to go into slavery, to go into debt, which is what's happening in America today. The problem with this is that everyone wants to be part of the elite, and there are too many elite over time. Okay? So even though the elite have many kids, the power is a zero-sum game. It's a hierarchy. And so this leads to the idea of elite overproduction. Okay? Elite overproduction. This is a term coined by the historian Peter Turchin. Okay? And his theory is that you have turmoil, you have wars, for example, the French Revolution, for example, the fall of the Roman Republic, because there's too many elite and they start wars to accumulate power for themselves. Okay? So this organization, this elite, leads to basically factionalism or infighting. And that's what's happening in America today, where the Democrats and the Republicans, they hate each other, they refuse to get along. It leads to political polarization, okay? So another saying this is that an empire over time becomes insular. They don't care about what happens outside the world. All they care about is what happens in Washington, D.C. And as a result, they make a lot of stupid mistakes, okay? Right. Now, last thing is death. Okay, the problem with death is that if there are no consequences to your actions, you become arrogant, you become lazy, and you become incompetent, okay? Because you don't care. It doesn't really matter. This leads to the idea of hubris, okay? Hubris is just blindness to your own arrogance, a violent arrogance that makes you make silly mistakes, but you don't recognize your mistakes and you keep on repeating the same mistakes over and over again, right? So yes, it seems like the empire is invincible, but if you actually think about it, the empire, its advantages becomes over time its disadvantages, which will lead ultimately to its downfall, okay? So the mass leads to inequality, the organization leads to overproduction, which leads to factionalism, and death leads to hubris. That's why an empire must fall over time. But an empire cannot fall by itself. It needs an enemy that forces it to collapse, okay? And so what happens is that an enemy will emerge that will overwhelm the empire because it is able to take advantage of the weaknesses of the empire, right? And so what are the weaknesses of this empire? Well, the first major weakness of this empire is that the people aren't really motivated. So if you as people are really motivated, you have a huge advantage, okay? We call this energy, right? Now, as an empire, you become insular. You refuse to admit your mistakes. You refuse to learn from others. Well, if you are willing to admit your mistakes, if you're willing to learn, if you're willing to promote the best and brightest, if you're willing to be meritocratic, you have a huge advantage, okay? And so this idea of openness. Now, the last idea is this. An empire, it's fractured. So if you're able to maintain cohesion, if people are able to remain united, if they're able to have a common purpose, they'll be strong, okay? So if an enemy of the empire emerges with these three qualities, energy, openness, and cohesion, this enemy will defeat the empire. Does that make sense? Okay. So what I want you to focus on as you follow the news in this war between the United States and Iran is ask yourself a question. Will Iran become an energetic, open, and cohesive society? Because if it does, it will become invincible. The empire won't change because of hubris. It's too static, it's too stagnant, it's too bureaucratic. So the empire won't change. The empire will not admit its own mistakes.
To be fair, the core intellectual architecture the lecturer is drawing from is real and serious. The law of asymmetry, as he describes it, echoes arguments made by some genuinely important thinkers. The most obvious influence is Ibn Khaldun, the 14th century Arab historian and sociologist who wrote about the concept of asabiya, roughly translated as group cohesion or social solidarity, and argued that it was the primary driver of historical rise and fall. His observation was essentially identical to what this lecturer is describing: tight-knit, hungry, motivated groups on the periphery repeatedly overthrow bloated, complacent empires that have lost their internal unity. Ibn Khaldun wrote this nearly 700 years ago, and it remains one of the most compelling macro-historical theories ever produced. Peter Turchin's work on elite overproduction, which the lecturer explicitly cites, is also legitimate and worth taking seriously. Turchin is a complexity scientist at the University of Connecticut who has built quantitative models of historical instability and argues convincingly that societies tend to collapse into crisis when the number of elite aspirants dramatically outpaces the number of elite positions available. His book, Ages of Discord, applies this directly to modern America and makes a genuinely compelling empirical case. So when the lecturer invokes Turchin, he's not making things up. He's borrowing from a real and respected intellectual tradition. The historical examples also broadly hold up. The Persian Wars are a genuine case of a vastly superior empire failing to subdue a smaller, more motivated adversary. The Macedonian conquest of Persia under Alexander is a legitimate example of a peripheral military culture overwhelming a bureaucratically bloated empire. The Roman Republic's rise from tribal origins to Mediterranean dominance fits the pattern. These aren't fabricated. The pattern the lecturer is describing, hungry periphery defeats complacent core, does recur throughout history, often enough to warrant serious theoretical attention. The specific American vulnerabilities he identifies are also not invented. The political will argument is historically well supported. America's strategic experience in Vietnam, Lebanon in 1983, Somalia in 1993, and to a significant degree, Iraq and Afghanistan, all demonstrate that domestic tolerance for casualties is a genuine and binding constraint on American military strategy. This isn't a fringe observation, it's mainstream in military and political science literature. The manufacturing and munitions argument is similarly grounded in real reporting. Defense analysts have written extensively about the fact that American defense industrial capacity contracted dramatically after the Cold War and has struggled to keep pace with the demands of sustained high intensity conflict. The Ukraine war actually exposed this problem vividly. America found itself running low on certain munitions categories faster than anticipated. These are real strategic vulnerabilities. The problem isn't the framework in the abstract. The problem is how selectively and conveniently it gets applied. Watch the pattern throughout the lecture. Every single American strength is immediately reframed as a hidden weakness. Technology breeds complacency. Propaganda suppresses useful dissent. Money produces unreliable mercenaries. That's fine as an analytical move. It's worth interrogating whether advantages contain hidden costs. But the lecturer never applies the same scrutiny to Iran. Iran's weaknesses are acknowledged briefly and then immediately hand waved away with, but if Iran can transform itself, that asymmetry in analytical rigor is itself a kind of bias. Let's actually apply the framework honestly to Iran. The lecturer defines the three imperial weaknesses as mass leading to inequality, organization leading to elite overproduction, and security leading to hubris. Does Iran have these problems? Emphatically, yes, arguably more acutely than America in some respects. On mass and inequality, Iran has significant and worsening economic inequality, dramatically exacerbated by decades of sanctions. The Iranian middle class has been hollowed out. Youth unemployment is severe. The gap between the clerical and Revolutionary Guard elite and ordinary Iranians is enormous and growing. This isn't a stable social foundation for a long war. On elite overproduction and factionalism, the Iranian political system is deeply fractured between hardliners and reformists, between the regular military and the IRGC, between clerical factions, between technocrats and ideologues. The IRGC itself has metastasized into a massive economic empire that controls significant portions of the Iranian economy through essentially rent seeking behavior, exactly the dynamic the lecturer describes as destabilizing for empires. The internal politics of Iran are extraordinarily complicated and fractious. On hubris, the Iranian government's response to the 2022 Masa Amini protests demonstrated a regime that was deeply out of touch with large segments of its own population, particularly younger urban Iranians and women. The protests were the largest since the revolution and were met with violent suppression rather than any meaningful political accommodation. That's not a picture of a flexible, self aware learning institution. That's a picture of an organization that has drunk its own Kool-Aid, to use the lecturer's own phrase. And then there's the cohesion problem, which the lecturer identifies as one of the three key advantages the challenger needs. Iran is not ethnically or politically homogenous. Kurds, Arabs in Khuzestan, Baluch in the southeast, Azeris in the northwest, these are significant minority populations with complicated and sometimes hostile relationships with the Persian dominated central government. The very ethnic and political fragmentation the lecturer describes as a weakness of empire also exists within Iran. None of this gets mentioned. This is probably the most serious intellectual criticism of the lecture. A good theory should be falsifiable. It should make predictions that could, in principle, turn out to be wrong. The framework as presented here cannot be falsified. The lecturer says Iran will win if it becomes energetic, open, and cohesive. If Iran wins, the theory was confirmed. If Iran loses, the theory will presumably say Iran failed to achieve the necessary transformation. You can never prove the theory wrong, because there's always a post hoc explanation available. That's not a scientific or rigorous theoretical framework. That's a narrative that can absorb any outcome. Compare this to how a genuinely rigorous analyst would present the same framework. They would say something like, here are the specific observable indicators that would tell us whether Iran is becoming more cohesive and innovative. Here is a timeline. Here is what we would expect to see on the battlefield, in Iranian domestic politics, in military adaptation patterns, if the theory is correct. Here is what would falsify the prediction. The lecturer does none of this. He just says, watch the news and ask yourself the question. That's not analysis, that's vibes with theoretical vocabulary attached. The lecturer argues that America's control of the information landscape is actually a disadvantage because it suppresses dissent and prevents honest internal debate. There's something real here. Groupthink in institutions is dangerous and historically has contributed to catastrophic strategic errors. But the argument is presented too simply. Information control is a double-edged sword for both sides. Iran's government controls its own information environment extremely aggressively, including internet shutdowns, journalist imprisonment, and systematic suppression of dissent. If information suppression prevents learning and adaptation, this applies to Tehran at least as much as to Washington. The lecturer doesn't mention this. There's also something contradictory in the argument. The lecturer says America controls Google, YouTube, the New York Times, CNN. And yet, this lecture is presumably happening openly, being recorded, criticizing American strategy in explicit terms. If American information control were as total as the lecturer suggests, this kind of open dissent would be impossible. The reality is that American information control is contested, partial, and faces constant internal and external challenge, which is actually more consistent with the dysfunction the lecturer describes than with the monolithic propaganda machine he invokes. The political will argument is probably the strongest part of the lecture and deserves more credit than it gets, even from the lecturer himself. The asymmetry in stakes is real and important. For Iranians defending their country, the conflict is existential. For Americans, it is abstract, distant, and contested in purpose. This genuinely does translate into different tolerances for sacrifice and different levels of battlefield motivation. Motivated defenders fighting on home territory have historically performed far better than their material disadvantage would predict. This was true of the Vietnamese, of the Afghans against the Soviets, and of various other conflicts. But motivation alone doesn't win wars either. The Iraqi army defending against ISIS in 2014 was fighting for their homes and families and still collapsed embarrassingly. The South Vietnamese military was fighting for their survival and lost. Motivation is a necessary but not sufficient condition. The lecturer presents it as almost determinative, which is too strong. Stepping back and looking at the whole thing, this reads less like a lecture designed to teach students how to think about a complex geopolitical situation, and more like a lecture designed to persuade students toward a specific political conclusion that the lecturer has already reached. The theoretical framework is deployed instrumentally. It's there to provide intellectual scaffolding for a predetermined answer. The historical examples are selected to support the argument, not to genuinely test it. The counterarguments are either absent or dismissed quickly. Iran's real weaknesses are acknowledged only to be immediately minimized. That doesn't mean everything the lecturer says is wrong. Some of it is genuinely insightful. The Turchin framework is worth knowing. The historical pattern of peripheral groups defeating established empires is real. American political will and manufacturing constraints are genuine strategic problems. These are worth teaching. But a student who walks away from this lecture thinking they now understand why America will lose a war with Iran has actually been given a false sense of analytical certainty about an extraordinarily complex situation. Good education about geopolitics should leave students more aware of uncertainty, more attentive to the limits of frameworks, more skeptical of anyone who tells them the outcome is basically already determined. This lecture does the opposite. It offers the seductive comfort of a clean theoretical prediction while papering over the enormous number of variables that actually make the situation genuinely unpredictable. The most honest thing a lecturer in this position could say is, here is a framework that has explained certain historical patterns. Here is why it might apply to this situation. Here is why it might not. Here are the things we would need to watch to know whether the framework is tracking reality. I genuinely don't know what will happen, and neither does anyone else. That kind of intellectual honesty is harder to deliver and less satisfying to listen to, but it's far more valuable to a student trying to actually understand the world. Sonnet 4.6 Extended.